All right, boys and girls, we're ready to start chapter 3 of Lincoln, How Abraham Lincoln Ended Slavery in America by Howard Holzer. The Lincolns Go to Washington. In 1846, the voters of Springfield and the surrounding community elected Lincoln to serve in Congress. By now, the Lincolns had two small sons, Robert and Eddie. When it came time to leave for Washington, D.C., the entire family headed off to the nation's capital together. On their way, they stopped to visit Mary's father and stepmother. There they accepted without complaint the service of the Todd family's slaves. The Lincolns still had no violent objection to slavery, at least as practiced by people living in the South. They found Washington itself to be a southern city. Slaves could be seen everywhere, toiling away for many of the congressmen and senators at their homes and working around town as laborers, waiters, and drivers. When local slaves tried on one famous occasion to escape by smuggling themselves on a ship docked in the river, owners learned of their daring plan and recaptured them. Then the slave owners complained bitterly that anti-slavery congressmen were at fault for repeatedly making speeches against that black freedom was possible. Some of the angriest citizens formed a mob and marched on a local newspaper that supported the abolition of slavery. They nearly burned the office down. Taking up his post in December 1847, Lincoln met many congressmen willing to fight to protect slavery. From the windows of the Capitol building, he could see a horrific slave prison that had operated for 50 years along the street just below. It was a sort of livery stable, he remembered with distaste, where droves of people were collected, temporarily kept, and finally taken to southern markets. Lincoln was disgusted to see human beings treated precisely like droves of horses, but there was nothing he could do about the situation. These vile slave pens were perfectly legal. As much as they detested slavery, Lincoln and his wife made no secret of their affection for Washington's minstrel shows, at which white people blackened their faces and imitated people of color in grotesque songs and dances. It was a different age, and the way blacks and whites regarded each other remained a complicated matter. But there was almost no escaping the horrors of slavery in Washington, even at home. The Lincolns lived in a boarding house across the road from the Capitol. Many of the residents were fellow Whigs. Most disliked slavery. But one day, while Lincoln was away at work, a white man came to the door to arrest one of the free black waiters working at the house. It seemed that the waiter had been regularly sending money to buy his freedom, but had fallen short by just $60. That was enough to force him back into slavery. After a violent struggle that horrified the residents, Mary included, the dazed man was shackled and dragged back to captivity. None of the boarders had the legal right or moral courage to lift a finger to help him. Congress, however, was beginning to wake up to the evils of slavery. At least such could be said for its northern members. The Mexican War was ending with a great victory for the United States. With peace, however, came the addition of vast new southern territory, including Texas, and pro-slavery senators were eager to make sure such slave ownership would be permitted there. It was not just that they wanted slavery itself to spread. If slave owners moved into these new regions, they would be likely to elect still more pro-slavery senators and representatives. The so-called slave power in Congress would thus increase further, and slavery would remain legal for decades to come. Whigs like Lincoln objected. A Pennsylvania congressman named David Wilmot introduced a bill that would ban slavery from all the new territory acquired from Mexico. Lincoln later estimated that he voted for Whitmer's proposal dozens of times, but it never passed. There was still no strong or united sentiment in Washington to outlaw slavery or prevent it from spreading. In fact, for a long time, Congress was not even allowed to debate the issue of slavery. From 1836 to 1844, a so-called gag rule prevented the subject from ever coming up for a discussion, much less a vote. In 1849, Lincoln decided to do something on his own to combat slavery. Though he was only a first-term congressman and had very little power or influence in the House of Representatives, he proposed a law that would end slavery throughout Washington, D.C. Like many Whigs, Lincoln believed that the existence of slavery in the national capital was a national disgrace. Still, Lincoln's idea was quite conservative. It promised that slave owners in the city would first have a chance to vote on approval of the measure. It required that the children of slaves be made to work as apprentices. Many of his fellow Whigs thought Lincoln's proposal did not go far enough, but it apparently went too far for many of his other colleagues. Congress refused to consider the law, and slavery remained legal in the city for the next 13 years, but at least Lincoln had tried. Abraham Lincoln's career in Congress ended after just one term, 1847 to 1849. He had agreed in advance to let another Whig politician run for his seat next time. Much as he yearned to stand for re-election, he kept his promise to bow out. Believing his life in politics was over, Lincoln headed home to Springfield and resumed his life as a lawyer. He was certain that people would never call on him to serve in high political office again. Even worse news followed. In 1850, after a long illness, the Lincoln's sprightly 2-year-old son, Eddie, took sick and died, devastating his mother and father. Mary was soon pregnant again, but they remained in mourning for their lost second child for years. Lincoln's family and political life remained gloomy, but his legal business began to flourish. Typically, Lincoln and his fellow lawyers traveled together from town to town, signing up and representing clients whenever and wherever local courts went into session. They were not choosy about who paid for their services. To the surprise of some, for example, in October 1847, just before he left to take up his duties in Washington, Lincoln served as a lawyer for a client named Robert Matson. Matson was seeking to prevent his slaves from going free while they were working for him in the free state of Illinois. Lincoln argued that the workers were not residents of Illinois and thus technically remained in slavery. Illinois had passed a law 4 years earlier allowing masters to take their slaves into free territory for what were called sojourns, or temporary work. Pennsylvania allowed slaves to sojourn there for up to 6 months, New York for 9. In the Matson case, the judge ruled otherwise and set the slaves free. Some people, then and since, have criticized Lincoln for taking the case, but as a professional attorney, he believed he had an obligation to defend people to the best of his ability. The Matson case provides yet another example of how long it took Lincoln to become a true anti-slavery man. In these years, it was Stephen Douglas, then a U.S. Senator and not Abraham Lincoln, who achieved fame and success in Washington. Senator Douglas helped pass Henry Clay's Compromise of 1850, an attempt to cool down the increasingly heated national argument over slavery. The package of bills called for California to enter the Union as a free state. It banned the trading of slaves, but not slavery itself, in the nation's capital. But to achieve so-called balance between the opposing sides, it also introduced a tough new Fugitive Slave Act that required all Northerners to capture and return runaway slaves. For years, brave abolitionists had helped fugitive slaves escape through a system of secret safe houses known as the Underground Railroad. Throughout the North, opponents blasted the new law as the cruelest and most inhumane yet introduced in America. Many abolitionist whites and free blacks vowed to disobey it. The rising young African-American leader Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave, urged fellow black men to resist the new law to the death. Lincoln disliked the law too, but at the time saw no way to fight it. I hate to see the poor creatures hunted down and caught and carried back to their stripes and unrewarded toils, he said of the Fugitive Slave Act, but I bite my lips and keep quiet. All right, I'm going to stop there for today, and we'll do the second half of chapter 3 tomorrow.